Hey, this is Joshua from the church at Mon River. If you've been worshiping with us on Sunday mornings or following our YouTube channel, you know that we have been going on a study through the gospel according to John. And we've been working week by week, just walking through this text, verse by verse. And here we find ourselves in John chapter 8. This is a very popular story about this woman who was caught in the act of adultery, and the Pharisees grabbed her and threw her into the city square, and they go to stone her. But Jesus steps in and he condemns the Pharisees, and he saves this woman from being killed by them. And while this is a very popular story, we're choosing not to teach it in our study of the book of John. And so why is that? Well, in my English copy of the scriptures, I use the Christian Standard Bible. I have this note in parentheses. It says the earliest manuscripts do not include John chapter 7, verses 53 through chapter 8, verse 11. And there's another footnote in the bottom of my Bible. It says other manuscripts include all or some of this passage, but in different parts of the Gospel of John. You see different passages listed there. Some manuscripts even include it later on in John after John 21. And then, in fact, some manuscripts don't even have this story written by John. They have it showing up in the book of Luke. And so what's going on here with this particular passage? Well, in order to help you understand this and understand why we're not choosing to teach this, let me explain a little bit about the history of the Bible and how these manuscripts have been passed down to us to today where we have our English copies of the Bible. Well, the New Testament was written between about 45 AD and 90 AD. And unfortunately, there are no copies from the original authors of the Bibles. We have nothing that was written in Paul or John's actual handwriting. In these days, there was no printing press, there's no copy machines or computers, and paper didn't last that long. And so the churches, they would make copies of the original writings, and they would pass on copies and copies and copies to other churches, and this is how the Bible spread. And these copies, these ancient manuscripts, have been passed down to us today. And I just want to take a second to compare these ancient manuscripts of the New Testament to other historical documents from that time period. Can look at Caesar's Galactic War. This was written in about 50 BC. Today, there's about 10 usable manuscripts that still exist. The oldest of these manuscripts was written about 900 AD. The books of Roman history were written in about 17 AD, and today there exist about 35 ancient manuscripts, the oldest of which is from about 400 AD. Tacitus, he wrote two books, one called Histories, another called Annuals. These were written about 100 AD. Of these collection of books, only portions of the books exist today, and the oldest of which is from about 900 AD. Now let's compare that to the New Testament ancient manuscripts. Today there's about 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts of the New Testament that exist today. And the oldest fragment that we have is from about 130 AD. Compare that to some of these other ancient documents. There's a substantial difference, especially considering that the oldest book in the the most recent book in the New Testament was written at about 90 AD. The fact that we have manuscripts from 40 years later is pretty significant. And you compare that of those other documents from that time period, there's about 35 manuscripts of one compared to 6,000 ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. That's a very big difference. But among these 6,000 manuscripts, there are some very minor discrepancies as you're comparing 6,000 different documents. And I want to talk a little bit about why these discrepancies exist. Well, there were scribes who were copying these ancient manuscripts, and usually they did so by dictation, where one scribe was reading and another scribe was writing. And about 95% of these variations that exist were accidental. They were copying 138,000 Greek words, and when they were doing so, sometimes they wrote the wrong letter that looked similar to another letter in Greek. Sometimes they added an additional letter in their Greek word. As they were copying through dictation, sometimes they heard the word wrong and they wrote a word that sounds very similar to a different word. That accounts for about 95% of the variations that exist. But there's about another 5% of variations that were intentional changes that the scribes made. Let me give you a few examples. Sometimes they took it on themselves to revise grammar or spelling mistakes. Sometimes they made small changes to match one story up with another story. So if they're copying something from the book of Mark, they might change one name of a location so that it matches up with the same name of a location in the similar story in the book of Matthew. Maybe they came across two variations themselves in the things that they were copying, and sometimes we see that they combine these two variations together to form a new sentence. They also might add common traditions from the church. One example of this, we think about the Lord's Prayer. That final line, "For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever, amen." This, if you look in your copy of the English scriptures, there's probably a footnote for this as well that says the earliest manuscripts do not contain this line. And so why did the scribes likely add it in? Well, the church was probably often reciting the Lord's Prayer, and they added this final line in as the church was reciting it. And so while it maybe wasn't part of the original words that Jesus said and were written down by Matthew, the church would often recite this phrase. And so when the scribes were copying this part of Matthew, they went ahead and added in this closing phrase to the Lord's Prayer, even though it wasn't in Matthew's original words. And so with these different variations, once something becomes popular, then it continues to be copied and passed down. Think about that game that we played as kids called Telephone, where one person at the beginning of the line would read a script, and then they would whisper it in the ear of someone else, and they would do it to someone else. And by the time it got to the 20th person, it looked very different from what the original script said. And as these manuscripts were passed down, they were done so in 4 different regions of text, different traditions. The English translations, like the King James Version, were based primarily off one of these regions. It was the Byzantine tradition. And so as those authors of the first English Bibles were looking at ancient Greek manuscripts, they primarily were just using one particular source. The authors of the King James Bible, it is believed that they were using about 11 ancient manuscripts to come up with their English translation. I believe that they were being faithful with what they had at the time, but they were just limited in their resources. But now, today, due to modern archaeological finds or the worldwide sharing of information, modern biblical translators have over 6,000 manuscripts to work from. And they have manuscripts from all 4 of those regions of text, not just one. And so they have a vast amount of early information to compare and to contrast. and they see a great amount of similarities between all 6,000 of these ancient manuscripts, but there are some variations that exist between different manuscripts. And so while the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8 was passed down through a particular tradition, when we look at all of the information available, especially the oldest manuscripts that we have, it's likely that it was not a part of the original Bible. It was not originally written by the author John. And even though some manuscripts do have this story, sometimes they're found in the margins. Sometimes they're found in the book of Luke and not John. Sometimes they're found in different places in John with different vocabulary. And all of this evidence is pointing that it was likely not written by John. And so we think about all of this. I have two takeaways for us. One is that this should not cause us to doubt the authenticity of the Bible, but to trust it even more. We can have confidence that the English translations that we have today are very accurate. And any possible discrepancies that might exist are written in the footnotes. They show us that the translators are being upfront with us. And we can make these decisions ourselves on whether we want to read and teach the story of the woman caught in adultery. The second big takeaway that I have for us is that even if this story is not originally written by John, it still could be a true story. Jesus could have had this interaction with the woman caught in adultery, and it could have been passed down orally. And scribes could have added it in because they heard it passed down to them. It certainly matches the character of Jesus found elsewhere. Him showing mercy to the sinner and him condemning the Pharisees for their hypocrisy. But it is because it was likely not in the original Bible that I've chosen to not teach it. I hope that this lesson has been helpful to you. If you'd like to think a little bit more on this issue of manuscripts or the King James Bible, or if we can trust the accuracy and authority of the Bible, I've linked 2 short videos in the comments section below that you can watch and think a little bit more about that.